Here we are. We're going to talk about muscles in this lesson, and we're really probably going to be very brief with all of our discussion of muscles. It's a very deep subject, and you can go on and on and on, and we're going to do a very brief introduction of muscles in our companion animals. And look at this guy. Okay, almost spooky. Well, that's all skeletal muscle, right? We're going to find out there's three kinds of muscle. I guess I'll state them now: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. They're located different places in the body. Skeletal muscle is aptly named because it moves the skeleton. And I just thought this was kind of a dramatic picture. I'll get him out of the way and show you another animal affected with the same mutation. Look at this guy. Wow. That's a real animal. And you might call this hypermuscularity. Sometimes it's called double muscling. These animals are called double muscled. And it's very interesting. It's a genetic mutation, got to say that. And it's been documented in dogs and cattle, like I just showed you, but also humans, mice, and sheep. You can find pictures of animals that have the hypermuscularity. Now, since I showed you all those skeletal muscles on those two animals there, the bull and the dog, I want to just say a brief little thing about how skeletal muscles are named, because if you ever take an anatomy class and do dissection, there's all kinds of names, and some people don't realize how complex all these names are. So I've got two images here. That one I'm going to get out of the way a little bit here. But Sophie here, God bless you wherever you are, Sophie, and the dog, and there's the genus species name for the dog, by the way, up here. You can see these are pretty much the superficial muscles, skeletal muscles of a dog, and there's all kinds of names, and oh my gosh. And you can study this for days and days and semesters. If you ever go to vet school, you'll study the anatomy of dogs and other animals, of course. But it's very complicated, but the names are all over the place. And I wanted to show you the system that skeletal muscles are named by, or what's used. And the kicker is there's not one convention. So look at this table here, figure. Sometimes they're named by the location where they're at, sometimes the shape, sometimes the size. I like this one, gluteus maximus and the gluteus minimus. I think there's a guy in Brazil that helps women accentuate those muscles. I don't want to get in trouble here or seem sexist, but I know he's on TV, so when I go to my news station, sometimes he's there advertising this. Anyway, sometimes the direction of the muscle fibers, sometimes the location of the attachments, sometimes the number of the origins, sometimes the action. The bottom line is naming the skeletal muscles is really complex, and it takes a lot of study, and that's all I want to talk about naming. So now, remember, we're just doing a brief overview, and I wanted to show a couple images that people have made. There's different ways of classifying muscles. You know, that's like taxonomy is a system of classification. When you look at them under the microscope, they can either be striated or non-striated. And striated is skeletal and cardiac, and non-striated is smooth. Or you can talk about what causes them to move. Voluntary muscles, voluntary action, classification, that's skeletal. Like if a dog wants to move to the food bowl or chase a rabbit, whatever, that's usually voluntary. The only exception to this is you got to remember reflexes are something that moves a skeletal muscle, and if it is a skeletal muscle moving, and it ends up being it's a reflex that the mind has no control over. Although if you know your like the knee-jerk reflex for humans, your brain's not involved initially, but you can feel the hammer going against your little knee, the rubber hammer, and you could say, I'm going to not move my muscle. But if you close your eyes and don't know what's coming, that muscle is going to contract because of the sensory reflex. Okay, so then involuntary muscles are muscles that are going to contract without you having anything to do with it, at least consciously. Cardiac muscles, they pump, the heart pumps, the muscles contract. And then smooth muscles, a good example is in your digestive tract. You don't say after a meal, okay, muscle contract, now not contract, okay? Let's do a couple other images here. You should know where these muscles are located. Okay, let's start with skeletal over here. They're going to be attached to the skeleton, to bones, and they're going to move bones. And we talked about the neuromuscular junction, the motor end plate, it's also called, when we did neurology. You might want to go back there. Cardiac muscle is different muscle fibers. It doesn't need any nerve telling it to contract. So it's like intrinsically contracting. When we talked about the heart, we did talk about that, although there is extrinsic supply to the cardiac muscle. But remember, a beautiful proof of it doesn't need that extrinsic control, neural control, is when heart transplant patients receive a new heart, they don't get the nerves connected that run from the spinal cord and brain down to the heart. The muscle is going to contract by itself. And then finally, smooth muscle is found in basically internal organs. That's a good way of saying it. The GI tract, the esophagus, ureters, the uterus, bladder. Very good. Very good diagram here. Then I wanted to end with one that's really good that you should study and pause because it's got some function listed with it. So here's the three types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, visceral. Sometimes smooth muscle is called visceral. It gives nice little location: skeleton, heart, and then there's a lot of places where that smooth muscle is found. The function, and I like this because it also added heat. And you could actually have heat for all of the muscle, but the reason they put heat here particularly is because about 40% or so of the body weight of a normal animal is skeletal muscle. And when you're moving, you add a lot of heat. Okay, obviously pumps blood, cardiac, and then the smooth muscle controls peristalsis. That's muscle movement in a tube. We're going to talk a little bit here in a little bit. So anyway, then its appearance. Okay, does it have one nucleus or more than one? Skeletal muscle, the muscle cells have more than one nucleus. That's interesting. And then, of course, like the control. So that's a good little table to end with this little part. So, I just want to make sure it's very clear how these muscles contract. We could call it control of muscle contraction. So, voluntary muscle is one way to classify it, right? It's muscles that move the skeleton. And I like this little statement: innervated by somatic nerves. Somatic nerves are basically nerves that you can say, I'm going to move my finger, and you do it. Okay? Innervation means giving a nerve supply to some tissue or organ. Then we have involuntary muscle. An involuntary muscle is innervated by autonomic nerves. The autonomic nervous system is at fight and flight. That's called sympathetic, and parasympathetic is the feed and breed system. So all muscle is innervated, but you got to remember the cardiac muscle is special muscle cells that are modified by those nervous inputs, but can contract by itself. Okay, so let me get that out of the way. I just want to make sure you know how muscles are controlled. And of course, this is skeletal muscle diagram. The nerves come off. Now I want to orientate you here. This is dorsal. This is ventral. And the reason I'm saying that is because all motor nerves leave the dorsal root. They are going to carry messages this way. Okay, usually to a gland or muscle. And you should know that this is called the dorsal root. This was ventral. I think I said ventral. And this is dorsal. And this carries in sensory information like touch, pain, thermal receptors, so forth. Anyway, there's your innervation of skeletal muscle. Then, smooth muscle has a special case where it still needs neurotransmitters, and that's here. Look at neurotransmitters binding to receptors. Sarcolemma, means the muscle membrane, the cell membrane. And anyway, neurotransmitters are released from these varicosities. I'm over here on the left. Okay, and you can kind of see they're dispersed, but it doesn't end. The nerve is coming here, it's also going there, so that's different than the motor end plate. But when there is a stimulation on this nerve, through stretch receptors or whatever, the neurotransmitter diffuses across to the membrane and causes muscle contraction. And the other thing I haven't said is for any muscle cell, it either contracts or it doesn't. That's an all or none phenomenon. So you might say, how does a dog jump higher or even higher? Well, it recruits more muscle cells to contract if it has to have more force. Okay, so this is a beautiful diagram. Wow. And finally, this was a beautiful diagram. I've blown it up kind of big, and it's a little fuzzy, but I think that's better than having it too small. So I want to talk about smooth muscle in especially tubular structures. And you know, most of the smooth muscle is in some tubular structure. And basically, I'm going to show this. This is a transverse section through the gut, which means gut means intestine. So when you do a transverse section, that means perpendicular to the long axis. So when you cut a tube in a transverse section, you get a cross section. You get the end view. And here's the lumen. I'm doing this in red. It's not labeled, but there's a lumen where food particles, ingesta, would be. Okay? And there's always some mucosa, and there's a lot of increased surface area in the GI tract to absorb nutrients, and we'll talk about that when we do digestion. But I wanted to say there's two layers of smooth muscle. When we're nearest the lumen, the first layer of muscle we hit is the circular layer, and it basically runs around the intestine, not down the length, but around the circumference. Okay, and then the next layer out, nicely labeled here, is the longitudinal section, which runs the length of the tube. Okay, so they do different things. The circular causes segmentation, and the longitudinal fibers causes wave-like contractions. You want to have food particles move from, let's say, from the stomach back towards the anal area, and it's all being moved by contractions. If you ever see animals during surgery, it's one thing I've always amazed at how much movement the intestines are doing, even under surgery. They're moving, they've got to be, and that's a sign of a healthy animal when the digestive tract is contracting. So I thought this would be a good place to end. You can read the rest of the text. It's probably pretty much what I already said. Thank you, and this ends muscles.